This is the Conversations with the Mind podcast, where we explore consciousness through conversations with interesting people. Our mission is to engage the collective mind piece by piece to bring greater clarity of mind to our listeners locally and across the planet, and to contribute to broaden the shared experiential knowledge and wisdom of existence. All right, folks, welcome back to Conversations with the Mind. I'm your host, as always, Shane Lemaster, and we're here for episode number 73 with very special guest, Dr. Cole Marta. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. First question is the same question that goes out to everybody, and that is, the title of the podcast is Conversations with the Mind. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, from your individual consciousness, how does that phrase land, and sort of what comes up for you around conversations with the mind?
I feel it feels like a comfortable concept. I feel like I personally spend a lot of time with my mind. I tend to live in my mind, and for better or for worse. And I think conversations with other minds helps to stretch and exercise those muscles, so that it's not like the same muscles getting worked every time.
Nice. So you got to switch it up to, it's like, in your workouts, you got to switch up the routine a little bit.
Right. Got to get those muscle fibers that aren't getting activated in the old routine.
Nice. So just for the audience and for myself too, could you describe sort of what you're doing with work in consciousness?
Yeah. So I'm a site investigator on the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD trial sponsored by MAP, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. We've been working with them specifically since 2017 is when we started enrolling for a phase 2 trial. And now we're on the phase 3 trial. We're just wrapping up one of two and moving on to the second of two. And prior to that, I did, I guess primarily my work with consciousness has been in the field of psychedelics. So prior to that, I published some non-clinical research papers on ketamine, which one of the book chapters in the ketamine papers, what I was co-author on. I wrote a paper about ibogaine, and just a few non-clinical publications. And then in my clinical work, part of doing that research starting in 2013 probably on ketamine for depression, I got to know some clinicians that were working with ketamine already. And so when I finished my psychiatry residency program in 2015 and went into private practice, I had a tremendous mentor who showed me the more practical aspects of opening a clinic. And I've been trying to focus primarily on working with ketamine-assisted psychotherapy for treatment-resistant depression primarily, but also some PTSD and a few other conditions it seems to be helpful for. And that's come kind of to define my work. I've been able to sort of piecemeal together a little career, working primarily just with psychedelic medicines, which is really something my inner child would be very thrilled with. My younger self would be very excited to see what I'm doing now. Mm-hmm. So that's exciting.
Yeah, it must feel so fulfilling to be able to do what you love and to be able to sustain life on this realm anyway by doing it.
Yeah, it's rewarding, challenging and rewarding.
Nice. So you mentioned ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and I'm versed in the differences between the different ketamine models. But for some of our listeners who might be interested or might have heard about ketamine as an emerging psychedelic therapy that's legal, maybe we could discuss the differences between the models: ketamine-assisted psychotherapy versus ketamine-assisted therapy, which I think is a bit more prevalent, at least in our area in Colorado. There's a lot more clinics that are using the ketamine-assisted therapy model with very little psychotherapy included.
So there these clinics that are more like just offering the ketamine as like any other kind of treatment.
Yeah, just another outpatient. Folks will come in, and it's almost like looks like almost like a plasma donation room. People stacked up next to each other, and they just get hooked up to an IV or IM. They have their session, and then they leave with very little integration afterwards.
Right. Yeah. So the protocol that I use in particular is based around the research that I did as part of writing that publication about, as far as the frequency, the routes of administration, bipolar versus unipolar. Lots of sort of data was examined in this cumbersome paper that I co-authored, and that informed sort of the procedural part. Then the psychotherapy part comes from just, for me, my experience working with psychedelic states in being trained and working with MAPS, seeing what are the core central themes, because the training for that was already happening prior to starting the study in 2017. And so a lot of the central themes of the MDMA work have been brought into sort of the model for ketamine, the therapy portion of ketamine. And I think in general, it's always been sort of a gold standard in treating depression and anxiety that medication and psychotherapy are better than either one individually. Like that's something that's been shown over and over in the data. So, coming from a mental health background, I think the value of that is even more impressed upon me. It's something that's been hard historically to demonstrate empirically in data and stuff. But there is, whenever they do measure for it, they find evidence that it's better to have therapy than to not have therapy, especially when you're working with people who are in fragile mental health conditions. So, one sort of concern in general about the just ketamine model is that if it's treating a mental health condition, if they're not getting therapy there, it's my opinion that, and the evidence suggests too, that that supporting them psychotherapeutically it just would be kind of the gold standard of treatment for mental health conditions.
Yeah, I agree with you totally. And I'm one to think that therapy is good for anybody in general. Just talking to somebody about your life, in a confidential way, having a confidant, that's so powerful. But, it's interesting. I'm wondering if are there any specific non-mental health issues that ketamine has its eye on for being able to help with? I know that it's helped with chronic pain, and that's the only one that brings to mind. Maybe neurodegenerative diseases. What were you saying?
Anesthesiology, right? Like its original. It's on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. It's an invaluable tool because of its very unique side effect profile compared to other anesthetic agents. But then, pain, kind of in parallel to the mental health sort of rediscovery of the power of the medicine, has been in the world of pain management, it seems to have been, there's a growing body of literature showing that it's helpful for lots of treatment-resistant pain conditions also.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, very promising that this, and still, the stigmas around ketamine being more of a club drug still stand. I think in a lot of the general public, but all these breakthrough treatments are coming around, and I think a lot of people are hesitant to sort of switch camps because, what the line we've been fed our entire life is that drugs are bad. Drugs are going to fry your brain. Drugs are going to do this irreparable physical damage. And I know part of your research and specialization in the past has been around psychedelic harms. And I think that that's a huge piece that we need to just name when we're doing altered states work is, the stigmas and the myths around it versus what we're actually seeing in the data as far as any sort of physical harm coming from these.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they're powerful tools, and I think that that's a really useful way to think about them because, if we think about other, powerful tools, like literally power tools, power tools can do fantastic things. They can also be harmful. You could use tools, like hammers, power drills, can be used to build a house, and they can be used to destroy a house. They can be used to hurt somebody. They can be used to save somebody. So, that's sort of the way that I've come to conceptualize how I look at all drugs, not just psychedelic drugs, but all drugs. There's a very real clinical use for cocaine. There's a very real clinical use for Wellbutrin. There's a real clinical use for ketamine. And it's not necessarily, I think the concept of there being evil molecules and not evil molecules is something that I don't subscribe to very much anymore.
Right. Yeah, it comes down to the intention behind the use and the motivations and all the drivers going into it. I think that's what's going to tell you most about. Yeah.
Yeah, and dose and frequency and all those things. Those are all things that are really, really important when we're talking about using them clinically. In my opinion, we have to know what are our doses, what's safe, what's the safe frequency, safest. How do we mitigate those dangers?
So coming from a clinical background, and I come from a semi-clinical background in psychology, but I'm wondering, if our biases here are coloring this a little bit through those lenses, and I'm wondering if there's, if you maybe see any potential out there for ketamine to also be a healing facilitator or conduit for recreational users as well, people who don't necessarily have anything that they've identified as wrong with them, but may just want to explore their spiritual selves.
Yeah, I think that's fertile ground, like, to explore, and I do like to make the distinction, like where I feel like I can speak with more certainty is in the clinical application for diagnosable mental health disorders. And I feel like, outside of there, I have opinions, but I don't think that they're more valuable than anybody else's opinions. But I do see that as being an area where, you just hear about, these stories where people have had these phenomenal growths. There's lots of anecdotal evidence that, there's something to these things, in people who don't necessarily have a psychiatric condition. But I think it's very important to distinguish between the two, and for those two sort of struggles, social struggles, to be distinguished from one another. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely know quite a few people who recreationally use ketamine for spiritual reasons
Yeah,
and for self-growth. And, you know, they educate themselves on it beforehand. They take safety precautions. You know, they read the literature on it, which is
right.
important to do, and they're very well known. You know, they know what they're doing, and then yeah, you hear these transformative experiences. I've had a number of transformative experiences with recreational ketamine in the past, where you know, I feel like I couldn't be where I am today on the path that I'm on spiritually without having been informed by those and having integrated those. And
Yeah,
it's a part of who I am now. And
right.
you know, I feel like there's potential for that out there for bettering the well, you know, the people
Yeah,
who are already see themselves as well but want to explore something deeper.
yeah, and I think there's, within, so that that effort doesn't have to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. There is the precedent already of positive psychology in psychology of finding ways to research that. Like I think there are. I definitely still believe in science and the scientific method, and I think that would be really interesting place to explore. And I think some of the psilocybin stuff has kind of gone there. Like Johns Hopkins studies about lasting characterological changes. The stuff that's going on in like the religious studies collaborations there with bringing leaders from different world religions together and having a shared psilocybin experience. Effects on creativity that have been, so I think those are all amazing and fascinating. And yeah, I think too, as far as another thought that came up when you were talking about that was, I guess something that's bubbling anxiety in me is about just where we are right now historically in history, is the sense that the excitement about psychedelics as a broader topic is moving at an exponentially faster rate than the science can possibly move.
Mhm.
And so, like in my head, it's like too much muffin mix has been put in the muffin cup, and like like the muffin top is just becoming overflowing the overflowing the entire oven, and inside the cup is all that we know scientifically.
Mhm.
Whereas the excitement is this like ever expanding, rapidly accelerating phenomenon, and and both in the psychedelic scientific, like the psychedelic psychotherapy community and the non-scientific community in the psychedelic community, there are a lot of ethical, educated, mindful actors. Um, and as if 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 this is going to grow and become the phenomenon that it could become, then it's going to move past those people that are like that, you know. And and so my anxiety is about like how we keep everyone safe when that core of people who are mindful and will do the research, um, when the demand for it grows to a population outside of that group of people, to the people who won't look into it as much, or people who won't treat it with as much care, or how do we talk about it and word it in a way with precaution that, you know, keeps it, that anybody look into it doesn't feel like it is totally safe and harmless to just go explore, you know? Like how do we navigate that in a mindful way is where like most of my conversations lately have been going to. Like, as this thing, it just feels like, I don't know, maybe since well, kind of all along, but it really got supercharged with the Michael Pollan book. And before that, even the Michael Pollan article. And now, you know, just the more media attention it gets, the broader the audience awareness becomes. And it's the same amount of people who are, you know, the nerds, if you will, the nerds that will, you know, stay home and read about this for, you know, days, weeks, months, years before ever even dipping their toes into something,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I'm right there with you. You know, the feeling that I get from, you know, this, whatever it is, psychedelic revolution, psychedelic renaissance, new emergence, reemergence, whatever we want to call it, it feels like, you know, we're this steam engine train and we were chugging along almost stagnant for so long because of prohibition. And now, you know, we're starting to get speed. And even in the last like 5 or 10 years, like we are hauling ass down these tracks now.
Yeah.
And we're excited and we're having a blast, but we're also sort of afraid, like if we go too fast, too quickly, then we're going to derail. We're going to go off the tracks, and then there's going to be destruction, and we're going to have to start all over. And so
Right.
this idea has come up in a number of my other podcasts I've had with you know, psychedelic practitioners around, you know, how do we create a culture here in the United States around psychedelic use, both recreational and medicinal,
Yeah.
so that we have our own context, so that we're not appropriating inappropriately, you know, from other indigenous cultures and things. We have our own culture here, and
Right. Yeah.
we need to define it for ourselves if we're going to move forward in a mindful way, like you said.
Yeah. Well, you know, in my, that's an awesome topic, and I think one that doesn't get talked about often enough. I was doing an interview one time, and this uh, this concept occurred to me uh, of scientific bypass,
Hmm.
or
Like spiritual
spiritual
bypass.
bypass,
Yeah.
or spiritual bypass, but scientific bypass, where science is being appropriated to validate non-scientific things. It's like, you know, come to this retreat because science has validated MDMA for PTSD in a very select population that's extremely well filtered, and, you know, like, you have no idea like how hard it is for people to qualify for these studies. And then, so to extrapolate that to like MDMA is good for everyone who's been traumatized is like an enormous scientifically, no scientist would ever defend, you know. And so it's, in my mind, it's similar to this spiritual bypass concept of like, no, 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 no. Like, this isn't science, nor does it necessarily want to be. Like, you know, curanderas and Huichol Indians and Huitis and you know, the shamans of South America are like, they have entire contexts outside of the Western medical and scientific model that are that I don't think we need to use this science to try to validate that. I don't think it needs that validation. I think that's a very different thing. And I also think we do have our own Western medical, you know, those of us who identify as Western Westerners, I guess, we do have our own history now, and I think it gets overlooked. You know, I think it was mescaline was first, identified in the late 1800s in a Western, model. Psilocybin and LSD since the 30s, 40s. The whole scientific process being applied to that discovery through the 50s and 60s until the 70s, there was a fully functioning psychiatric clinic in Maryland, the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, that treated thousands of patients, did dozens of studies that published, it was an entire campus that did nothing but psychedelics research and clinical practice. And so, and we've learned our lessons from there. We're still dealing with the same, cultural contexts and things. Like, if we want to make, if the desire is for it to have legitimacy within this context, then it gets very muddy when we try to mix these cultural contexts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree too. And I'd say that in our culture too, we definitely have the medical story, right? We have the medical model to psychedelics and how we're using it for mental health and physical health and things like that, and spiritual health even with the medical model. And then there's this whole other story that's also a part of our Western culture, which is recreational use of psychedelics and mind-altering substances with their own rituals that go into those practices and their own interpretation. Yeah, and so I think we need to see that both are happening and acknowledge that both are happening, and that's not going to stop, and then start to have conversations with all aspects of this culture to try and put a boundary around it, at least a transparent boundary that can grow or whatever as our definitions shift. But I think we need to, as a culture, come together and figure out, what the hell are we going after here? What are we doing with these things?
Yeah.
Otherwise it won't be legitimate.
Yeah, and how do we, what are we trying to achieve? How do we know when we're doing it? Mm-hmm. How do we know when we're not doing it? How do we know? Yeah, it's weird because I never thought of myself as like an institutionalist, like someone who believed in institutions, and I've always, prior to the years of work now in this field, I didn't see the value that I see now in having ethics committees and review boards and oversight, and it's very similar to, it essentially is, sort of a community. I guess that's something that could be harnessed. Still, there is a community. It's just when it's, as long as these are illegal drugs, as long as they're still criminalized, it's harder to enforce any kind of, when a psychotherapist, for example, violates some ethical code, their license can be taken away, and they will be publicly shamed. Like, you can go online and look up any practitioners, like any complaints that have been levied against any practitioner on their state board, for example. Like in Colorado, there's one of these boards, and that's a diversion tactic. As unpleasant as that is, it serves a function of keeping everyone acting with integrity. And
yeah, it seems like a community of checks and balances a little bit.
Yeah, that's really hard to do in this black or gray market. because how do you enforce rules in a black or gray market? You know, historically, it's like been disastrous how you enforce rules in black markets. And so we don't want to go that route. But yeah, I think that's if any community can do it, this one, it's a big task to figure out how we police this thing so that it can be handled within these communities rather than outside policing and outside systems.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think it all starts with education. I always go back to education as, educating people and informing them so that we're not making choices from ignorant places, and I'm the first one to admit, how little I know about anyone else's experience, but I also, we're all experts in our own experience too. So
right. Yeah, informed consent.
Yeah.
That's the in the trials we do, it's a very big part of our process is the informed consent process. Also in our clinical practice, the informed consent process is a cornerstone of providing a safe container. And so that's at least a model that can be utilized. Yeah.
Yeah, so, even using terminology from maybe other cultures like container or like ritual or ceremony or any of those things can be incorporated and almost layered on top of medical model. I mean, in your clinic, do you do IM or IV treatments?
Primarily IM.
So IM, yeah. So, I mean, there's a whole ritual that goes into that, the clinician drawing it out of the bottle, maybe saying a prayer over it together beforehand, putting it in and taking the plunger out. And all these things are part of the Western ritual around it. The informed consent, creating container, the professional, the relationship, the rapport you building that container. So I see how we can utilize traditional wisdom around these medicines without appropriating and doing disrespect to them. We're paying tribute and paying respect by acknowledging that these things are real and they have real effects on the experience itself, and then taking that into account in our own models as well, incorporating set and setting on a heavy note, and I think that's important. But at your clinic, you mostly see treatment-resistant depression?
Primarily, yeah.
Okay.
There's basically things that there's evidence for. We're really trying to maintain that boundary and that line, or we're really protecting that for our clinic because we want to continue to, we believe very much in the scientific process, and I think it's important to protect that process when it comes to being a medical clinic. If we're going to call ourselves a medical clinic, then I want to hold our practices to the same standard as any other medical practice.
Yeah, it's in my mind, it's so kind of fun and funny to intermix my concepts around medical model and transpersonal work, like these two things coming together in a way that is it reminds me of what I've read in history books of medicine as it was practiced, like back in the Asclepions in Greece, where practitioners were giving out mind-altering substances in a medical practice and having these healing experiences, and how far away from that we have come in the medical model now, where I think the majority of the field of medicine probably does not even speak to the spiritual realm, or does not integrate the spiritual in their biopsychosocial models yet.
Right. I mean, certainly less so. I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things about this, this niche field in medicine is, the first time I saw a presentation on psilocybin residency program, you know, they were saying in the presentation, they were talking about, you know, the mystical experience, and somebody in the audience was like, well, how do you measure the mystical experience? And it was just matter of fact, there is a measure, mystical states questionnaire, you know, like, it's pretty remarkable. I think we can accommodate, you know, spiritual experiential factors within the scientific model, but of course, yeah, I think language will limit exactly how precisely we can capture those things, but I think it's a pursuit worth undertaking. Like, you know, that is something that's been demonstrated in, for example, Matthew Johnson's paper about psilocybin for smoking cessation. And the title is Psilocybin Occasioned Mystical Experience Correlated with Smoking Cessation. So it was not psilocybin, it wasn't correlated to dose. What they found was the extent, the sort of the degree of mystical experience predicted their success, not dose. So like other studies have established that like heavy meditators score higher on these mystical questionnaires at baseline likely, but definitely on with psilocybin. And so I think it still behooves us to try, at least within medicine, to establish ways of testing these ideas, testing these theories.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
it's not undoable, I think, to study. You know, there are entire fields of academic study dedicated to spiritualism and religion, philosophy, and you know, I can only imagine they have their own whole system of measures and units and stuff.
Yeah, and you know, there's definitely something to be said about measuring whether a mystical state has occurred or not, or you know how intense it was. So I assume you've read most of Johns Hopkins mystical state experience research, right, with psilocybin, showing that it was you know the what was it, the variable that showed the closest correlation to long-term well-being changes in patients. Did you see that one?
I'm not sure. Is it openness?
Yeah, that was one of the ones where it talked about those character personality shifts.
Right.
Yeah, and the one you referred to with the Smoky Sensation, that was not the one I was referring to. I think in that study too, a big component to that was that the participants had the intention to quit smoking going into the session too. So that was that expectation was definitely a part of it. But the Rolling Group, or not, you know, Johns Hopkins came out with this mystical states. And I'll just share it for the audience. But they tested psilocybin, and folks who had a mystical state important, most of them said that it was one of the most important formative experiences in their life. I think some of them said that it was the most important experience of their life. And I think it was a high rate, like 80% of them, even long term, said that they did not regret the experience, that it was only beneficial.
Right.
So this idea, and this is sort of where my dissertation centers around, is studying this mystical experience through a social sciences lens. But really, I want to try and take that work that Johns Hopkins has done around mystical state experience and psilocybin, and see if we can't apply some of those similar concepts to the mystical state experience as experienced through ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. like you said, these are different tools, but many of these tools can take us into those mystical states. And I'm thinking that mystical state itself is probably pretty damn important, especially in ketamine therapies as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's pretty established that ketamine does provide that, and I want to say Vollenweider might have done that. Franz Vollenweider,
Mm-hmm.
uh, in Switzerland. My, I, with the scale was the 5 dimensions of altered states of consciousness scale,
Mm-hmm.
the 5DASC. I believe he did like a series showing, like he did it with LSD, he did it with psilocybin, I believe he did ketamine too. But yeah, I believe ketamine provides that experience, certainly. I mean, people have described clinically having experiences, that are very much the ego dissolution experience, that, independently arising without, with as much objectivity on my part as I can maintain. People reporting basically the list of the altered states experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I think the ketamine can provide those experiences. And I'm curious, like, for some reason, in our discussion now, this kind of thought that has been bubbling, as Western civilization, as Western cultures have kind of moved away from organized religions, has there been a measurable need for something? Is there something, is there a baby get thrown out with the bathwater kind of thing? As people were disillusioned with their particular organized religion or faith, was there something in there? Because a lot of those things that are championed about the way that indigenous cultures administer psychedelics are things that take place in a church, or in Western cultures, that's where ceremonies are. It's where people make meaning of tremendous loss, and it's where they make meaning of tremendous love. It's where they make meaning of community and togetherness and ceremony. And so, yeah, I wonder if there's my intuition tells me that there's some relationship there between the sort of loss of the value placed on those things as the agnosticism and atheism has grown, and then this sort of, is there a connection? My intuition is that there is, that people are looking for something that they used to get there, but for legitimate or illegitimate reasons, they've moved away from, in increasing numbers, away from those organized religious entities that used to be the place where those things happened, and we have these, decreased emphasis on the psychospiritual aspect of life in general.
Yeah. I see both, an increase in materialism and capitalist ideologies and things in our culture. But when looking into, I was just recently wrote a paper and was looking into post-materialist theory. And they talk about, what happens when the basic needs, based off of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, when the basic needs are met, where do people's motivations go? And they tend to go to the higher levels of self-actualization, self-transformation, and these types of things. And we are increasingly materialistic in our society, but because of that, we have for the large part, I mean, if you look at the statistics, we've never experienced a greater period of prosperity in all of human history. Even with all the poverty and starvation still in the world,
Yeah.
per capita, like we are utilizing our resources in a way that is feeding and meeting those basic needs of most people. And so, I've also looked into some statistics too, where what you're saying is exactly happening. Like more and more people are going and seeking mental health clinicians and professionals for spiritually related issues. Not so much for things that,
Classic depression.
yeah, right. Like people are seeking that
Classic,
sense.
like, depression, the syndrome that we have come to define as clearly as we can. Yeah, I feel that, maybe it's because of the specific, um, well, in my training, I saw a broader patient population. But yeah, it does feel like a lot of people come, with the self-report of depression, and they certainly are depressed mood, like their mood would be described as depressed, but they don't necessarily have the appetite changes, the energy changes, the motivation changes, the anhedonic aspect, the guilt and shame, suicidal thoughts. It's more like a malaise um, and an existential kind of depression. Uh, we see a lot of that, certainly. I think they're not mutually exclusive either, I guess I should say.
Yeah, I'd agree with that too. And so I brought up that mystical state research because I feel like it's been well justified so far in the literature that mystical state experience is super important to the process. My question, taking it a little further in my dissertation, is more centered around what are some of the psychological antecedents or contextual precursors that can lead to the mystical state experience, right? So in your clinic, I'm sure you have patients where you've given them the same dose over 2 different sessions, and in one session they'll have mystical state experience, whereas in the other they might not. And
Yeah,
so I'm trying to figure out like what might be pre-correlates to or preconditions that cause more mystical experiences, whether it's belief system, intention, expectation, the set and setting, all these things, and what, I don't know. I feel like if we can figure out what are some of the precursors, then we might be able to enhance the treatment protocols to give more people this really powerful mystical experience more frequently.
yeah, yeah. I don't have any strong data to back this up, but I can say that in my experience, we do a series twice a week for 4 weeks is sort of the default process, and then maintenance could be anywhere from 0 to monthly, or that varies case to case, but in the series, as people move through the series, they tend to have more powerful experiences. And so early on, I had kind of this working theory that that it had something to do with secure, attachment model. That as they were improving in their depressive or anxiety symptoms and feeling more secure in the room and developing a stronger relationship, that was allowing them to go further, to go deeper. I think ketamine compared to LSD or psilocybin, people do have a tremendous ability to not necessarily stop the experience, but compared to LSD or psilocybin, they can control the intensity I think more so. Like there's no making it go away, but they can have just a disorienting experience if they resist entirely, right? But I think more recently, I feel like it's it's getting them comfortable with the not knowing. Like it's overcoming the experiential avoidance that, you know, at those first sessions, they don't know, especially if they're totally psychedelically naive. You know, they have no lay of the land, and so there's a lot of not letting go, of not going with the experience, not being open, um, not being, not trusting the experience, not being able to let go, not being able to be open. And the more you can do to get them, you know, that's even a potential, that's even a suggested mantra, is trust, let go, be open. Um, Going into the session, if they can get to where they really can trust the experience, let go and be open, which um, I think it really helps. It's been a powerful part of this strategy of staying very scientific in the clinic here and staying very medical. You know, being able to answer people's questions in the same way I would if their question was about sertraline, you know, like being able to speak with that same kind of authority and confidence provides a level of trust in the person that I think is hard to measure. But I think that allows, I think that's an important part of the way that we're doing it here, is people feel that they can trust, let go, be open in a context that's familiar to them. You know, they're in a medical clinic or speaking that language with them that they're used to.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I was thinking definitely about the ability to let go. And I call it an ability very consciously because I feel like it can be trained into somebody. I come from a background, I have a master's degree in sport and performance psychology. And so I'm all about, studying optimal mind states of like surgeons and Olympic athletes and stuff like that. And learning how we can train the mind as a tool in and of itself to work for us. And one of those tools, especially in these spaces, is that ability to let go. And so I'm thinking maybe, if we can, other forms of practice like meditation and things like that, I think could help people learn to let go more into the unfamiliar. And so I think it's possible that we can in the future design even pre-session training protocols where we prime people's minds and give them the skills necessary to let go and to navigate the spaces and to give them the confidence while always, building that supporting relationship. Because for me anyway, it's been difficult for me to let go into those experiences unless I feel completely safe to let go. I'm always presented with the question in my ketamine experiences of, it says, we're about to show you what you want to see. Are you ready to let go of what you know to be shown what you don't know? And, that's always the jumping off point. And you have to, with blind faith, jump into that. And what I always find every single time is pure love. So it's never anything bad that I go into.
Yeah, it's interesting that you used the word faith. That that was a recent big, epiphany and conversation I had with one of the co-founders here, Ashley Booth, um, and we had a little discussion about, is that faith or is that trust? Because what is the faith in? I think it's faith. I was arguing for faith because, in that experience or in any experience, I feel like faith is, been co-opted by like religion and stuff like that. But I think, and it's actually, the way we're talking about having faith, it's really like feeling secure in, so the way she was defining it was trust is learned through previous experience, and faith is without that evidence, right? And in these kinds of experiences, you don't have any evidence for the unknown by definition, right? and for whatever reason, this was coming up in a thought exercise that I was doing around winter time, and it was like, is this an, philosophically an antidote to anxiety? Faith, like I'm a believer that much of anxiety is our minds being stuck in the future, trying to prepare, trying to prevent, trying to safeguard against something, that a lot of anxiety is about preventing something bad, right? And so having faith is almost like, they're hard to hold at the same time. They're hard to, they almost seem mutually exclusive to me. But yeah, but another term I used to use in kind of trying to prepare people for the ketamine experiences is surrender. But I think trust, let go, be open is kind of what I've adopted more recently. Trust, let go, be open. Anything you can do to reinforce those things, I think, helps people have, I think what holds people back is that resistance to letting go. They manifest their own struggle in that space by basically trying not to have the experience that would happen if they can surrender or let go.
So maybe you can help me here for a second. So I've been, part of my dissertation, I'm trying to formulate these interview questions, right, for this qualitative research project. And I'm wondering if, from your clinical experience around this idea of faith and letting go, what could be some questions that I might ask folks who have had a mystical experience? Maybe, what have your experiences in the past been around letting go, sort of to build up my data set to inform, like, what was this person's psychological strengths and toolkits around letting go prior to the experience? What do you think could be some useful things?
I think it could be useful to, you're talking about preparing somebody?
No, more like in a reflective practice. So after someone has had a mystical experience, I'm trying to figure out what was their mindset like before around letting go that allowed them to have that experience?
Yeah, I think it'd be useful to have people who do, and I think it'd be useful to have those people who do and do not have those experiences, and asking them a lot of the same questions about that, like asking them about where they were with regard to letting go. Was there something they were holding on to? Was there an expectation that they had? A lot of it can be really useful prior to explore what people's expectations are. Are there things that they are hoping are not going to come up, because hoping they don't come up will probably make them come up. So those kinds of, between the two groups, were there things that were there expectations? Were there, where were they with regard to expectations, fears, prior experience, experience with letting go? I mean, I think at least, mindfulness meditation is a lot about being able to not attach, to let go of thoughts and sort of not attached to the monkey mind. So asking them what their previous experience is with practices of letting go.
Nice. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, I'm really excited for this project. It's coming together, and hopefully I'll be running it here in a year and a half, 2 years. So I'll keep you informed on that one.
Cool. Are you going to do it in a clinical, are you going to do questionnaires?
Yeah, so I'm tied in a little bit with the ketamine clinics here in my area. And so, I plan on sort of integrating it into their already going clinical practice. So they're starting to implement the mystical states questionnaire just as part of the normal protocol. And so I would just come in, they would offer, voluntary enrollment in this research study before they enroll in their treatments. And then if they agree, then I would provide an interview about a week after each session, just to sort of recap the experience and go over some of these possible preconditions. And it also, the interview itself also provides space for further integration and gives direct benefit to the clinic and to the patients themselves. And so I'm hoping that, I can be doing good for these participants in research who are also patients, but also be collecting data without stepping on the toes of the clinicians doing the work. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, we'll see how that goes. And so we've been talking a lot about protocols and things like this, but I kind of want to get into what the ketamine space is like, right? Because there's people out there listening who are like, yeah, this is all well and good, but the unknown is freaking scary. Like, what is it going to be like? And so, I've shared a number of my personal experiences with ketamine on the show, and from stories you've heard, from things you've seen in your work, can we put our limited words to the task of describing what ketamine space is like?
That's the $1 million question. What is it like? I can say, even with the same person, with the same dose and the same playlist in the same room, it can be very different from one session to the next. In either direction, as far as it could be more intense, it could be less intense. That seems hard to predict. What seems universal is it's an altered state, certainly. Dissociation isn't even described universally in my experience, but most people feel a dissociation from their usual self or their body. Some people have profound visual phenomenon. Other people see absolutely nothing, and that has come up in integration sessions, like some that they were expecting, some visual phenomenon that they'd heard described, and then other people, that seems to be what happens to them every time. Some people have a sensation of movement. That's not uncommon. Sort of maybe in a non-frightening way, a feeling of sort of falling backward or turning to one side or another. And a lot of people describe a fundamental change in their relationship to their sort of psychological self. Some people find it a welcome break from their usual self, how they experience themselves and their thoughts. A lot of people have like a melting or quieting of the monkey mind, and the sort of chattery thoughts. And most people describe, have a profound experience. There have been ego dissolution, as it's been described before, where people feel the dissolving of their identity. They forget who they are, where they are, what they are, and in as non-anxiety inducing a way as that could be experienced. There does seem to be less anxiety in the reports than I hear from LSD or psilocybin. Like, I think those experiences are very well documented with LSD and psilocybin, but even in the altered states of consciousness questionnaire, one of the main categories, if I recall, is a sense of anxiety at the loss of sense of self. Whereas, though I've witnessed that in some patients, some anxiety over that phenomenon, it's more broadly the just not knowing what's happening. And I have definitely seen a lot of people that make that transition without any anxiety, that they felt very comfortable transitioning to that place and reporting a sense of boundlessness or connection or connectivity to everything. Depressed patients a lot of times have described in the integration a sense of seeing a broader perspective. Like, depression can be very isolating, can make your world very small and your thought circles very tight and small. And I've heard multiple people separated in time and space report, being in a familiar place that was larger and reminded them of a whole life inside them outside of that world that they had. It's just a small piece of their universe. And that being a very useful thing to reflect on in session.
Yeah, so a lot of different places, a lot of different spaces.
Yeah.
I know across my use, I started using ketamine back in my teenage years, 16, 17, 18, things like that, recreationally. And I was having anything from like what would be similar to like near death or out of body experiences. I astral projected a couple times and saw things happening in different places that were happening where I wasn't present. I've had benign experiences where nothing's happened, and I've had experiences where I've opened my eyes in the ketamine space and see everything made out of Legos, going into like a Legoland. And it was funny. I went on like trip reports or something online, and other people were reporting seeing this Legoland too. So it was kind of funny to see some similarity between different experiences too. I think that's always interesting to look at, sort of like how Rick Strassman looked at the similarities between different people's DMT experience. So I think there can be some similar constructs found in that space between patients. That's really interesting.
Oh, I lost you there. I'm sorry.
Oh,
You went
that's
on
right.
trip reports you discovered the Legoland universe and you went on trip reports, and what happened?
And yeah, I found that other people had that same visual experience of just seeing everything made of Legos. Yeah, so
Lego?
yeah.
Yeah, uh, I've heard, well, at least in my mind, the image reminds me of some experiences I've heard people give of DMT and being in like a computer chip city is something I keep hearing.
Mhm.
Like a city made of blocks and lights and things.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, um, something I've had people report to, and I'm curious, is like a sense of telepathy or some unspoken connection, a sense of sacredness happening in the room with, I typically work with a co-therapist. Um, More often now, they'll have I'll just administer medicine, and the therapist will sit with them. But regardless of the particular setup, people feeling a sense of like they're connecting in a way that's very, very meaningful and unspoken. I'm curious how you have experienced others who may be present physically in the, sort of default uh, space. Um, yeah, with regard to that, like any disillusion of boundaries between you and others in a very like um, where it seems like people's ego structures are still intact in this space. Like I've had patients tell me like I'm still me. I'm not like part of this unified collective consciousness that happens to some people of the ego dissolution experience. It's like, no, they're still them. I'm me. I'm in the room, but you know, we're somehow unified in some thought process or goal or struggle that they're having internally.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've definitely had experiences where I know there are certain people in the room, and I will see myself as, yeah, being unified with them. But to me, that still speaks to it being a unity consciousness experience, where you see the individual ego, but you also know that they are you and you are them.
Uh-huh.
And they're, so there's, yeah, it's interesting. Just real quick, what do you think are your thoughts, or what are your thoughts on the potential for mixing certain medicine or methodologies, like maybe, I mean, you have experience with MDMA, so maybe someone takes some MDMA early in the session to open them up more to letting go, and then you administer ketamine so that they can go really deep, and mixing those two, or maybe mixing ketamine with psilocybin to do something similar with the psilocybin and helping that letting go process.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think um, like this is the frustrating part. I think uh, there's potential there, and I think we owe it if we're going to introduce mixing medicines to a clinical population, then we owe it to that population to do the research first, and that's frustratingly slow. But I, it's a very difficult emotional burden to to be simultaneously in a place where these medicines aren't available to so many people, um, and feeling a sense of their potential and not being able to provide it to them. And one way I keep um, my spirits up despite that is I envision 30 years down the line, there will be even more people, and even more of them will be, if we can do the due diligence to make sure that we aren't experimenting on people, to me it comes back to the informed consent process. Do people know that this hasn't been well studied when we mix these things? And again, this is also in relation to the clinical mental health population and within medicine. I want to be able to speak as confidently about introducing a second substance as I do about having the first substance in the first place. And that requires this very slow process of doing the research. But there's, there's such fertile ground there to explore. I hope that we can get to the point where the grant money that's available for everything else becomes available for these kinds of questions. Then it won't go so slow. It'll still go slower than people who are suffering right now want it to go, and myself included. I don't want it to go this slow. But in 20 years and 30 years, a lot of those same people will still be suffering, and these questions will have been answered, and these things will be available. That's kind of the way I have to conceptualize it.
Yeah, and I think we can still talk about it theoretically,
Yeah.
and there's certainly people out there already mixing substances and then putting out their reports. I think there can be studies done currently where we sample and interview folks who are already doing these things recreationally and sort of figure out what benefits are they getting and what should we be looking into when we eventually do get to those clinical trials. We need to have a basis, theoretical framework for what are we going to even explore based off of what people's experiences are already.
Right. Yeah, and I think based on that, like what I would like to, what I would imagine would be useful in combining the two would probably be, for depression in particular. Ketamine's shown to be so helpful for depression primarily, and the MDMA, I could see the MDMA's qualities making it so much easier to trust, let go, and be open, that really the MDMA could really support the ketamine work.
Mm-hmm.
Because between the two, like MDMA is very much, in my opinion, works very much on the ego consolidate, like when your ego is intact, like it doesn't dissolve the ego. It's a phenethylamine, it's a stimulant class at its core. It at least at the doses that we're talking about, that we're studying, causes a very intense experiencing of the egoic self. It may even amplify that. Whereas the ketamine is closer to the classic tryptamines in that it dissolves the egoic self. So it's like the MDMA is what happened to me, Cole, Marta, when I went to medical school and the horrible thing that happened there or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the psilocybin and the ketamine is like, who the hell is Cole and what is medical school? That's and that's not ultimately important. Like the lessons are very different, and the healing, therefore, I just feel like comes from very different places. The healing comes, the MDMA, I think, can help functioning with. I think it's so helpful. My personal opinion is it can be so helpful for PTSD because it can help people fundamentally feel safer again. It can make people feel connected again. At least that's my hope. And the connected to this world, to this, to our day-to-day lives, to real relationships with others. And then the tryptamines and ketamine seem to get more into that psychospiritual realm of feeling a connection and a purpose and a connectivity. So psychologically, I feel like they are approaching from very different angles, but From the phase 2 data that's been published, the MDMA, the depression, the secondary scales that they measured, depression seems to improve too. We don't know if that's, I don't think the studies have been done yet to see if that's independent of improvement in PTSD. And we're talking about people who have been diagnosed with PTSD, but they do depression measures before and after in that population in those studies. And there's at least a signal worth exploring that MDMA could possibly be useful for depression independent of PTSD. So yeah, I think there are lots of amazing ways to combine these things, and things worth studying, things worth investigating.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time today, but I want to thank you again so much for spending your time and sharing your wisdom and knowledge with myself and with the audience. And if anybody wants to reach out and get a hold of you or contact the Center for California or the California Center for Psychedelic Therapy or anything else you're involved, maybe let them know how they can do that real quick.
Yeah, our website is Psychedelic Therapy CA, as in California.com. And the how to get in touch with us is on there. And our main admin's email is admin@psychedelictherapyca.com. And people interested in MDMA studies, psilocybin studies, I think clinicaltrials.gov is a governmental open available database of all clinical research that's happening that involves human subjects. And they have a search engine. You can put in, psilocybin depression, and you can learn about every study that's happening, every study that's recently closed, every study that's expecting to open soon. So that's an important thing I think people should know about. Yeah.
It's great. Yeah, I feel like we just scratched the surface, and I'd love to have you on the show sometime in the future if you'd be willing.
Yeah, anytime.
Great. It was a true pleasure. I'll probably see you in the circles that we run around in. And yeah, thank you for being on the show.
All right, take care. Thanks so much for having me.
Conversations with the Mind podcast is sponsored by mindops.com. You can find us at www.mind-ops.com. We're an eclectic counseling company providing mental health and mental performance services to individuals, small and large groups, teams, businesses, military, through face-to-face sessions or at a distance using phone or confidential video chat apps. We bring a unique Buddhist Western lens and specialize in general psychotherapy for all mental difficulties, sport and performance psychology for performance enhancement, addiction counseling for any maladaptive or destructive habits, and psychedelic integration therapy to make the most from your visionary medicine work. We are available as well for corporate workshops to address the needs of your employees' wellness.